Coming up this week on The Right Side, the landmark free trade agreement between Canada and the EU has been ratified. Canada has an immigration problem on its southern border, poor economic news for Vegreville, Alberta, and discussion on Motion M103, which condemns Islamophobia without defining it? This is The Right Side, Episode 4, recorded Saturday, February 18th, 2017. The Value of Trade. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for another episode of The Right Side. My name is Shane, and I'm co-hosting this week with a fine individual named Patrick.
Hello, everyone.
For those of you guys first joining us on this episode 4 of The Right Side is a podcast that aims to cut through the sensationalism and bias that often appears in the news media that you watch day to day, or that you read day to day. I think we can all agree that in 2017 and for a large part of 2016 and earlier, the news has just become so sensationalist and biased that it's often hard to figure out what the actual story is.
Yeah, I mean, we live in really interesting times with fascinating things happening in the world, and I think we really owe it to ourselves to really think critically about what's going on and to think about who's telling us what.
Right. And, everyone had thought that when Twitter and Facebook came around a number of years ago, that these would be great unifying forces. These would be great forces to disseminate information and, in effect, tell the right story of what's going on. But as it's turned out, I think a lot of people out there can agree that Twitter and Facebook, if you don't have an open mind, can actually become echo chambers because it populates what you see based on what you like and what you follow, which doesn't really give you the right side of the news.
Yeah, and that not just with Facebook and Twitter, which are the giants, of course, but also with other social media platforms, you can often be grouped in with other like-minded people and not really find out what's actually going on.
Right. And, so many media organizations these days also rely on Facebook and Twitter to tell their news stories that, sometimes it just gets swept away with the social horde mentality. And that's ultimately what we hope to, some of the stuff we hope to cut through here on The Right Side and deliver the news exactly as it is with the key point that everyone should take home. Exactly.
And with that, I think we should get right to it with the Right News Rundown.
Yes, the Right News Rundown for February 18th, Saturday. So this week, a huge story pertaining to Canada and actually the EU, believe it or not. The EU Parliament voted in favor of the landmark trade deal with Canada. The EU Parliament approved a landmark free trade deal with Canada, and this is a free trade deal that has been in negotiation for years and was actually first proposed in 2008, believe it or not. The EU Parliament backed the pact by a vote of 408 to 254 on Wednesday in Strasbourg, France, fending off a veto driven by far-left and far-right European parties that have echoed Trump's criticism of globalization. The deal, known as the Competitive Economic and Trade Agreement, is slated to end, you ready for this? 98% of tariffs on goods from the outset and 99% of tariffs on goods after 7 years. Each side plans to dismantle all individual tariffs and more than 90% of agricultural duties.
Which is a very significant number.
EU. Most definitely. The deal was first proposed in 2008. Negotiations started in 2009, ending in 2014. And, 2008 was when we were still in the depths of the Great Recession. So anyone can imagine, we're going to propose this landmark free trade deal in 2008 when the markets aren't doing well. And let's just see how this is going to stimulate economies going forward. So, very
almost
courageous.
10 years later, we finally have it.
Yeah, most definitely. And, CETA, this, I think, part of the story that people are missing out on is they're calling it CETA, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. But what it really is a free trade agreement with the European Union. Ultimately, CETA should be an example to the world of what free trade and a good free trade deal looks like. Free trade ultimately will work best when the agreements are tailored to the specific needs of the economies involved, in that case, Canada and the EU. Free trade does not work when you have a one-size-fit-all deal that encompasses multiple different levels of economies, i.e. first world and second world. Currency valuations and differing standards of labor also play a role in determining whether or not a free trade deal will be successful. Key example here, you have a country that has a currency that is so underpowered compared to a strong currency like the euro. If you put those two countries in an omnibus free trade deal with one another, one of those countries is not going to get the best part of the deal. So in order to fix that, you need to tailor specific deals to the strengths of each of the countries. And that's what CETA does for Canada and the EU.
And it's even more complex because when you're thinking about the euro, you're not just thinking about one economy. You're thinking of dozens of economies of the different countries, and all of the different intricacies of the the mixed economies that go in. Because the economy of, say, a powerhouse like Germany is a lot different than, say, Greece or Croatia or Estonia or Spain. You know, there's many, like Europe itself is quite diverse.
Yeah, and that, I think, is what makes the CETA so special, is the fact that we were able to get a deal that didn't necessarily exploit any of these countries, but also didn't unfairly hurt Canada in going in along with these deals. And, you know, when a free trade deal is well negotiated and it encompasses the criteria that I listed previously, it has huge potential to open markets and increase growth and prosperity for everyone involved in those markets. And, you know, I think the next part of this that is so profound is that, you know, while we can ultimately commend the Liberal government of the day for closing this deal, we also need to look back at the previous Conservative government and what they did for being courageous to, you know, propose such a deal when the world was in the deep recession and ultimately negotiating it from 2009 to 2014. And, you know, if you look back at the former government, you realize that this was what their legacy was. It was free trade deals, and this is the biggest one of them all. So, you know, as much as the former Conservative government under Stephen Harper can be criticized for whichever way, you know, whatever group decides to criticize it, the hallmark of that government has to be free trade.
Yeah, and just looking at the vote shares in the European Parliament for this, the only country out of the 28 that didn't overwhelmingly vote yes or even moderately was France. They were the only country that really voted no on this one, and then handfuls of pockets in other countries like Britain, Greece, and Netherlands, and I think Italy was the other one that I saw that didn't vote that much. But France was the only one, and France, of course, has elected to the European Parliament a lot of far left and far right politicians to the European Parliament as a way of backlash against the former kind of polarized politics that they have in France right now and for the past 5 years.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, it is such a complicated deal that with the amount of regulation in the EU and what you were saying, how you have far left, far right, combined with the regulation, you need to ultimately remember that it's not just one country here. It's 28 different countries. And that is a huge feat to get done. And, you know, the mere fact the former government was able to get such a deal built and, you know, negotiated speaks to the economic success that they actually brought to Canada, which, if you read the economic papers, you know, strongest middle class, highest percent GDP growth in the Great Recession, first country to emerge from the Great Recession. That, I think, at the end of the day, is what the former government needs to be remembered for. Free trade and just turning Canada into a pure economic powerhouse at the time compared to everyone else.
Exactly.
And, you know, you might not like the Conservative Party, you might not have voted for them, but they have demonstrated with this that they understood the economy. And hopefully when the next election rolls around, people will remember that if the economy isn't doing so well.
And I don't think it is right now.
No,
It's
it's
not
not.
doing as well as it was a couple years ago.
Right.
And the dollar has crashed.
Yeah.
I think there's lots of things that can improve that voters will have to keep in mind for the next election.
Most definitely.
2019.
And of course, here on the right side, we will be there with you guys, hopefully, to remind you of all this and spread some truth about the economy. All right. Ready for our next story?
I think we are.
All right. What is it?
This one's been something that's been developing over the past week or even 2 weeks. The headline is, "With open arms, Mounties help refugees who walked across the Canadian border." This is something that I picked up on last week that was happening is that refugees, mostly Syrian refugees, have been crossing over illegally from the United States into Canada, just walking across the border in the middle of the cold Canadian winter. And it happening across the country from Saskatchewan, Manitoba, even on Ontario and Quebec. And this was something that we found really interesting.
Yeah, because, I mean, if you look at the headline for this, you don't necessarily say, oh, Canada has a problem with illegal immigration. But, technically that's what is going on here. Basically, what's happened with this is over 450 people have made refugee claims at various land border crossings in the province of Quebec in the month of January of 2017. And this is up from 43 the previous year. So you can tell something is going on here. The mainstream media ultimately attests this to the immigration order that was put in place by President Trump in the U.S., but in reality, these numbers were increasing in 2016 prior to Trump even becoming president. So that fact put out by the media, you can kind of just shoot right through it.
Also, the fact that with the immigration order, it didn't actually apply to anyone who was actually still in the States.
That's
it only
right.
applied to people that were outside of it. So leaving the States is kind of a head scratcher if you're ever wanting to get back in.
Oh yeah, and I mean we do have an agreement with the U.S. that if someone comes to Canada or the U.S. and claims for refugee status, they need to make that refugee claim in the first country that they set foot in. So if that's the U.S., it needs to be the U.S. We also got some data on this from the CBSA, Canadian Border Services Agency, who polices our borders. There were 7,022 land border crossings by asylum seekers in 2016. Here's where it blows the media's fact right out of the water. That is up from 4,407 in 2015. So you can tell this was already happening before Trump even became president, and the majority of them would have happened before he was elected. So fast forwarding to this month, as many as 21 asylum seekers braved the cold and crossed into Emerson, Manitoba on this past Saturday, so last weekend, February 11th, and another 22 came over in the previous weekend alone. The refugees aren't just coming from countries with Trump's travel ban, believe it or not, as they would like you to believe in the reporting here. As many as 27 Ghanaian men have crossed into Manitoba from the United States, so Ghana, and that's not on the immigration order from President Trump.
Yeah, it's a country in West Africa for anyone who doesn't actually know.
That's right. Now, Public Safety Minister Ralph Goodale actually has said that the RCMP and the Canadian Border Services Agency are keeping a very active watch on refugees coming into Canada from the U.S. He also said that he will soon discuss border issues with U.S. Homeland Security Secretary John Kelly, though a date hadn't been set for those discussions as of this past Tuesday. And, that's good old Ralph, I think. Ralph Goodale, for me, is one of the people in the Liberal government that I respect and fully trust him to do his job, because he's been around for a long time.
Do. Yeah, he's been around since like the 90s in the Chrétien government, and he's been elected for quite some time.
He even served in Pierre Trudeau's cabinet.
Yeah, and through Liberal downturns, he was still quite popular and got elected even when other popular liberals failed to win their seats. So the fact that he's back in cabinet is probably a good thing.
Yeah, and you know, the fact he's got this and he's going to be meeting with the U.S. Border or U.S. Homeland Security Secretary to discuss this kind of calms most of my fears on this. That's why it's not our firing line story, because the government has it under control. But based on what Justin Trudeau says and his immigration minister, they really haven't talked about it, but Ralph Goodale has. So that's a little bit weird, don't you think, that Ralph Goodale is handling this and not the immigration minister?
I think it's all right because Goodale is one of the more senior ministers, whereas the immigration minister, I think it's Amarjeet Soji. He's kind of more of a rookie cabinet minister, so I think letting Goodale handle it is probably a good thing for the Trudeau government because he knows how to handle things because he's done it for decades now.
Our immigration minister is actually Ahmed Hussein from
right,
an immigrant from Somalia, believe it or not. So, but you know, with this, before we move on, it's also worth noting that the refugees from the U.S. are often charged huge prices to come here, upwards of $1,000 per head. And you know, when you think about it, it's not fair for a newcomer to either of our countries, because both Canada and the U.S. have generous refugee policies, and our countries are built on immigrants, so that's not right. And then, you know, the CBSA, as I mentioned, has the Canada-U.S. Safe Third Country Agreement, which basically says that if you land in either of these countries as a refugee, you need to make that refugee claim in the first country that you arrive in. Both countries are supporting this agreement, and the unfortunate thing about this story is that there's an actual loophole where if you don't cross at an actual CBSA border crossing, if you just cross in an unpatrolled area and you're caught, you are taken over by the RCMP, and you're not necessarily forced into this Canada-U.S. Safe Third Country Act, believe it or not. So that's a loophole.
Yeah, and the RCMP really has enough on their plate, you know, keeping Canadians safe. I really don't think they should be having to worry about all these illegal border crossings.
Yeah, most definitely.
Yeah.
And, you know, it just goes to show that the very definition of a country and a sovereign nation relies on it having borders. And if you have porous borders, you, in effect, lose part of what makes you a sovereign nation. So, you know, even though there's probably a good majority of people who want to take these quote-unquote refugees in who are crossing, they need to come in and attain Canadian immigrant status the legal and proper way, because if not, they're ruining the system for everyone. And the government needs to take account for this, and I'm happy that Ralph Goodale is. I would just like to see more from the Prime Minister and the Immigration Minister.
Exactly. And I think an important thing to note about borders is that something that we've noticed for the past couple of years in Europe has been a problem of the open borders, especially of the Schengen area. So I think something that Canada needs to focus on is border security and making sure that not only that people are keeping safe, but that it's orderly as well, and that there are lines when claiming refugee status. I mean, there's lots of people want to move into different countries, and there are ways of doing this legally and effectively.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't make sense why someone coming from a country that isn't facing war and ends up in the U.S. should come to Canada as a refugee if you land in the U.S. first. So
yeah.
We will, of course, keep on with this story unless there's anything else you'd like to mention regarding it.
I think that's all.
Okay, so our next story pertains to Alberta and an immigration office that will be closed if the government has their way in Vegreville, Alberta. So for those of you guys listening outside of Alberta, Vegreville is a small town, I think about an hour and a bit outside of Edmonton. And
it's east.
Yeah, east of Edmonton, hour or so outside east of Edmonton. Did I say west?
No, you just didn't say that.
Okay, fair enough.
I just thought it would be good to have directions. It's about 100 kilometers east, so it really depends on how fast you're going, I guess.
Okay. But basically, the federal government wants to close this immigration office, and if they do this, it will have huge negative downsides for the economy of Vegreville and the surrounding area. basically with this, the federal plan to close Vegreville's immigration case processing center could result in 420 people leaving the town, and in doing this, it would cut house prices by 30%, a new economic report said this week. Although most of the 236 staff would be offered jobs at the new site in Edmonton, a report by consultant Nichols Applied Management, Inc. released on Tuesday shows that more than half of them intend to stay in town and look for work, which could double the local unemployment rate. This drop in population would also hurt real estate values, cut municipal revenues by $1.2 million annually, and here's the real kicker, reduce gross domestic product, GDP, by $12.7 million.
Which is really significant, especially when you consider that Vegreville is just outside of Edmonton, but also it serves a lot of towns in the surrounding area that that are also smaller.
And
so
the
while you can
farms
say
and the hamlets as well, so
yeah, exactly, because that's just how Alberta's population works. I mean, sure, a lot of people live in Edmonton and Calgary, but there's a lot of people living that are spread quite across the province as well, right? And while people may say, well, there's only 6,000 people roughly in the town, that's pretty small, but it does serve a larger area, just other than just the city.
Yeah. And, this is part of the industrial heartland in Alberta. There's absolutely no reason why this should go forward when unemployment in Alberta is already at an all-time high. I mean, you just need to look at the data coming out of the province. Ultimately, the magnitude of this impact could be very well underestimated, since calculations on this are based on the current economic climate and forecasting a bit of a recovery in 2017. And ultimately, no one can be sure how strong our economy will be in 2017. That's just based on current trends. And if you remove this many jobs, you remove this much of the GDP, that could very well cut those forecasts in this region. Also, the cut in real estate values, revenue, and GDP would cripple the town and surrounding region. I mean, like you said, these towns act as hubs for not only the people that live there, but the people that live in the really rural areas surrounding it.
Yeah, exactly. Because going an extra 100 kilometers to Edmonton is extra time, because you have to do it both ways, and also the extra gas that you have to burn, so it costs extra money just to get to somewhere. If you're living, say, near the border to Saskatchewan, there's not really many towns that are near the border to Saskatchewan that are really closer than Vegreville.
Mm-hmm. And it ultimately raises a political question as well, because obviously the Liberals don't have a riding out there, so maybe they feel they're entitled to make such a move. And ultimately the cynical will say that the federal government has no stake out here, because this part of the country never votes for the Liberal government anyways, and those who are Liberal supporters in the city where the jobs will relocate will say that this is just based purely on a matter of efficiency, and this is the normal order of things. When something becomes efficient, it should move to the population center where most of the other government jobs are. Ultimately, the reality in this is that the current federal government, if they truly valued the small town Alberta lifestyle and the people in small town Alberta, and ultimately the voters and constituents that they could be getting out there, such a decision like this wouldn't be made. And, this is ultimately just another example of Alberta being taken for granted and the West not being truly appreciated for what it brings to the Canadian economy. We talked about this last week.
Yeah, and if they want to hold on to their 4 Alberta MPs, they're going to have to take note of Alberta eventually, that's for sure.
Yep. 2 in Edmonton, 2 in Calgary, which, I mean, Edmonton ones might be safe. Calgary ones probably not after this economy. So
yeah, well, I don't know if the Edmonton ones would be safe either. After this last election and what's been going on in politics recently, can any seat truly be safe?
Very good point. Very good point.
Yeah.
So if you're in rural Alberta, we are watching out for you here at the Right Side, and hope that this will not go forward. Ultimately, the story should have been reported more in the media. It wasn't. We hope that the powers that be will take note of this. And this story was from the Edmonton Journal.
Right.
Firing line time. So there's a motion going through Parliament. It's an anti-Islamophobia motion. A motion, just to get this out of the way, has no legal bearing. It doesn't change any laws. So this is just a way of saying, hey, Parliament, let's look at something and maybe do something about a certain issue. So here we go. Here's some of the text of the motion, called Motion 103, that has drawn quite a bit of controversy from various areas. So, that in the opinion of the House, this government should A, recognize the need to quell increasing public climate of hate and fear, B, condemn Islamophobia and all forms of systemic racism and religious discrimination, and take note of House of Commons Petition E411 and the issues raised by it. C, request that the Standing Committee on the Canadian Heritage undertake a survey or study on how the government could, 1, develop a whole-of-government approach to reducing or eliminating systemic racism and religious discrimination, including Islamophobia in Canada, while ensuring a community-centered focus with a holistic response through evidence-based policymaking. 2, collect data to contextualize hate crime reports and to conduct needs assessments for impacted communities, and that the committee should represent its findings and recommendations to the House that no longer 240 calendar days from the adoption of this motion, provided that in its report the committee should make recommendations that the government may use to better reflect the enshrined rights and freedoms in the Constitution Act and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Which honestly is a lot of words for saying we want to recognize that there's a public climate of hate and fear, and that they should condemn Islamophobia and all forms of systemic racism and religious discrimination. Huh.
Yeah. And, there's a few key issues with this. First things first, this motion does not define Islamophobia. Secondly, the motion singles out Islam and does not provide the same protection for other religions, and when in fact Jewish groups face the most hate crimes in Canada of any minority. This motion also has the potential to lead to many sinister prospects if adopted, including the amending of the Constitution Act or the Charter of Rights and Freedoms to explicitly condemn speaking out against an entire religion.
I think also another big point it brings up is that it assumes that Islamophobia is in Canada, even though it doesn't even define it. It's just putting the word out there as a buzzword. And
I think I said this on episode 1 or episode 0. The people of Canada aren't racist. At least the vast majority of them are not. So I don't think a broad stroke like this is actually needed. There are also issues in the media coverage for this story. The media has almost solely focused on the right-wing reaction to this story rather than seeing their points as legitimate areas of debate or discussion. The media also does not mention that Sharia law, which is what the Quran and Islam professes and desires, outlaws actual criticization of Islam. You can't draw the Prophet Muhammad. That's grounds for execution. Also, if the recommendations of the committee are followed, we could see laws on the books that ultimately just do that, prevent us from criticizing a specific religion. And, while the media will focus on this rise of Islamophobia, like you mentioned, they write daily stories about these perceived hate crimes, some of which have not been charged, and there is actually little to no coverage of hate crimes against other groups. So why is the media going on with a double standard?
And I think it's something to note that in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms for all Canadians, there is a freedom of religion, but there's also freedom of speech as well, and that there are laws already against hate crimes. But why do we need something else that singles out a singular religion?
Right. If Parliament really wanted to do this, they would make it against all religions and not just one. But even then, like you said, it's not needed. It's in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So if the committee does suggest that we need additional laws on this, that's when we have to start to worry, because we don't know what that's going to look like. And I think it in our society and in society in general, it's healthy to be able to debate things that we disagree with, and it's healthy for people to be challenged.
Yeah.
Lots of other religions have had these debates, and you can still have these debates today, whether it be with Christianity or Islam, right?
Yeah, I think it's important to note that these many different religions are very different from one another, and there's a reason why there's so many is because everyone has different ideas. And I think it's important to recognize that people don't all think the same way, and that we need to protect freedom of thought and freedom of speech and freedom of religion. And by doing that, we can't have motions that say there's systemic racism and religious discrimination, and that we condemn Islamophobia, because it's just by saying that that's taking place, it might exacerbate the problem.
Yep, most definitely. And, it's just ultimately what this question leads to. And I think you can have freedom of speech, but as soon as that freedom of speech is followed by the word "but," you are having problems.
Yeah.
Anyways,
it's like the political version of saying "no offense, but,"
right,
and then saying something offensive.
Yeah. All right, that was from Global TV, and, it was lots of erroneous reporting in the media, lots of ducking the actual issue of what this could lead to, so that is why it was the Right Side's firing line for this week.
And I think one of the biggest problems with it is that it didn't define Islamophobia, which is what we're going to do coming up right now on the Word of the Week, which is Islamophobia. Now, we looked at the Oxford Dictionary defined Islamophobia as a dislike of or prejudice against Islam or Muslims, especially as a political force. Now, that has many different connotations when you think about it, because their dislike of Islam or Muslims is one thing, but prejudice is another thing altogether. And saying that the two are similar is really, I think, substandard of a dictionary, don't you think?
Yeah. I mean, dislike and prejudice, okay, those are two kind of different things there. And, this is, I guess, an interesting definition for the word. I don't know what our government would define it as, but, to me, it just means you could remove the prejudice part and just have dislike against Islam or Muslims. But I think the core aspect of what we need to be looking at here is that it does not mean you are Islamophobic if you want to have a vibrant discussion about the religion itself. You should be able to do that. And it sounds like that's what M103 could ultimately end up curtailing.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that other such phobia words in the same dictionary aren't described as a dislike or prejudice. If you look at xenophobia, it says a dislike of foreigners. It doesn't say anything about prejudice against foreigners. So once again, we're getting another double standard just because it's Islam, I think.
Yeah. Oh, well, this is very interesting time, and we're just going to have to see how this all shakes out in the coming years.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I believe that's it for this episode of The Right Side. There was your weekly news, Right News Rundown, and Firing Line, and Word of the Week. So before we go, I'll just tell you that you can find us at rightsidenews.ca if you want show notes, full show notes there. You can also download copies of the show there if you don't subscribe on iTunes. If you want to do that, rightsidenews.ca/iTunes. You'll be taken to iTunes, subscribe on your iPod, Apple TV, whatever you choose. We'll have other podcatchers soon. You can also find us on Twitter and Facebook at RightSideCA. All one word. We look forward to hearing from you. And thank you for sharing your time with us.
And thank you, and we'll see you next week.